For 18 years, I taught her to ride a bike, helped with homework, and nursed her through fevers. I sold my beloved truck to pay for her medical bills and postponed promotions to attend her soccer games. I was the man who read bedtime stories and chased away monsters under the bed. But at her Stanford graduation, with one sentence, my daughter erased me from her life. I'd like to acknowledge the sperm donor who contributed genetically, but was never really a father. That day, something broke inside me. Not just my heart, but my identity. Everything I thought I was for nearly 2 decades. As I sat there, surrounded by applauding strangers, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. What happens when a father's love is rejected? How far would you go to reclaim your place in a story you thought you were central to? And what secrets lay buried beneath 18 years of sacrifice and silence? If you've ever loved someone who couldn't see your worth, this story will break your heart, and then show you how it might be pieced back together. Follow this channel for more emotional true stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about family, forgiveness, and the invisible threads that bind us together. Like and comment where you're watching from, and let me know if you've ever felt erased by someone you loved. My hands were shaking as I tied my necktie that morning. Not from age, though at 58 my fingers weren't what they used to be, but from something deeper. A tremor born of hope and fear tangled together like old roots. It was the same tie I'd worn to her 6th birthday party, the day she lost her front tooth and declared me her hero while sitting on my shoulders, chocolate cake smeared across her cheeks. "Daddy, when I grow up, I'm gonna make speeches just like you," she'd said, wrapping her tiny arms around my neck. 18 years later, here I was, slipping into the back row of her college graduation ceremony. I didn't want the spotlight, didn't need recognition. I just wanted to see her walk across that stage, to silently applaud the woman she'd become. The auditorium at Stanford was packed, proud parents clutching flowers and balloons, grandparents dabbing misty eyes with handkerchiefs. I sat alone, fingering the small gift box in my pocket, a locket with her baby picture on one side and a recent photo on the other, a timeline of love. When they called her name, Catherine Elizabeth Marlowe, my chest swelled. There she was, beautiful, strong, confident, the golden tassel on her cap dancing as she strode across the stage. My Katie, the girl I'd taught to ride a bike with scraped knees and determination, the teenager I'd waited up for on prom night, pretending to read the newspaper when she came home, the young woman whose college applications I'd proofread until my eyes burned. She wasn't biologically mine, but in every way that mattered. In every sleepless night and proud moment, she was my daughter. The dean handed her the diploma, and then something unexpected happened. Catherine stepped to the microphone. A special recognition, apparently. My heart quickened. I sat up straighter, breath held captive in my lungs. "I'd like to say a few words," she began, her voice steady and clear through the speakers. "First, I want to thank my mother, who sacrificed everything to give me this opportunity." The crowd applauded. Her mother, seated in the front row, waved. They hadn't invited me to sit with them. That should have been my first warning. "And I'd also like to acknowledge," Catherine continued, her eyes scanning the crowd before stopping. Did she see me? The sperm donor who contributed genetically, but was never really a father. The world stopped. Sound rushed out like air from a punctured balloon. Several people laughed. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few looked in my direction with something between curiosity and pity, but most didn't even know who I was. And in that moment, I died. Not physically, but everything I had been for 18 years evaporated. 18 years of bedtime stories, of science fair projects built at 2 a.m., of hospital visits when she had pneumonia at 12, and I slept in a chair by her bed for 3 nights straight, of teaching her to drive in empty parking lots, of crying in my car after dropping her at college, both proud and heartbroken. All of it, reduced to a biological function, a donation. The worst part? This wasn't a slip of the tongue, not a careless remark. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, the deliberate pause before she'd said it. She knew exactly what she was doing. It was a sentence, in both meanings of the word, a judgment and a punishment. And I, who had given up promotions to attend her soccer games, who had saved for years for her education, who had loved her through every tantrum and triumph, could only swallow hard as the auditorium erupted in applause. She had killed me with the same mouth that once called me daddy. When the ceremony ended, I didn't approach them, Didn't attempt to navigate the awkward congratulations or pretend I hadn't heard what she said. Instead, I watched from a distance as she posed for photos with her mother and her mother's new husband. As her aunt, my ex-wife's sister, hugged her with tears streaming down her face. As her cousins playfully adjusted her cap, I slipped the gift box back into my pocket. It felt heavier now, a weight of memories that apparently meant nothing to her. On my way out, a young man bumped into me, one of Catherine's classmates. "Sorry, sir," he said, steadying me with a hand on my elbow. "Are you okay? You look pale." I nodded, unable to form words. "Are you here for someone?" he asked, kindness in his eyes. Was I? Who was I here for? The girl who called me daddy? The teenager who needed me? Or the woman who just publicly erased me? I thought I was. I finally managed. But I was mistaken. As I walked to my car alone, the California sun felt strangely cold. My footsteps echoed on the pavement, hollow, like the space that had opened inside me. I passed families celebrating, popping champagne, taking photographs, normal things, things I'd pictured doing with Catherine since she was small. But I wasn't her father. I was just a sperm donor who contributed genetically. I started the engine and sat there, staring at nothing. How does a man recover from being erased? How does he breathe when the life he thought he lived turns out to be a fiction? I didn't cry. Not yet. That would come later, in the dark of my empty house, surrounded by photographs of a life that apparently never existed. For now, there was only numbness, and beneath it, something else stirring. Something that felt dangerously like resolve. I had lost my daughter today, but as I pulled away from Stanford University for the last time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, she had lost something too. She just didn't know it yet. The drive home from Stanford was the longest 45 minutes of my life. I didn't turn on the radio, couldn't bear to hear music or cheerful DJ banter. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and my own jagged breathing. Every few miles, her words would replay in my head like a cruel echo. The sperm donor who contributed genetically. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. How could 18 years of love be reduced to that? How could all those nights I'd spent assembling science projects, all those weekends teaching her to swim, all those scraped knees I'd bandaged, how could they just vanish? When I finally pulled into the driveway of my modest Palo Alto home, the sun was setting. The neighborhood was quiet, with just the distant sound of someone's sprinkler system ticking away. I sat in the car for a moment, unable to move. The small gift box with the locket was still in my pocket. I took it out and stared at it. All those years, captured in 2 photographs. All that love, made meaningless in a single sentence. Inside the house, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I walked straight to the spare bedroom, what used to be Katie's room before she left for college. I'd kept it mostly the same. Her high school debate trophies still lined the bookshelf. Her stuffed elephant, Mr. Trunks, still sat on the bed. The walls were still that soft yellow she'd picked out when she was 12. I knelt down and pulled out the old cedar chest from under her bed. It was where I kept everything. Her kindergarten drawings with stick figures labeled me and Daddy, birthday cards with her crooked handwriting, the Father's Day mug she'd painted in 3rd grade, report cards I'd signed, newspaper clippings of her debate team victories, and at the bottom, wrapped in a silk handkerchief, my mother's will. My mother had died when Katie was just 3. She'd loved that little girl with a fierceness that surprised everyone. "She's got your spirit, James," Mom would say, watching Katie tear around the backyard. "Stubborn as a mule, just like you." Before she died, Mom had set up a trust fund for Katie. It wasn't enormous, about $175,000, but it was meant to help with college or starting a life afterward. I was named as the trustee, with instructions to give Katie access when she turned 25 or earlier if I deemed it appropriate. I'd never told anyone about it, not even my ex-wife, definitely not Katie. I always thought it would be a wonderful surprise for her after graduation, a gift from the grandmother she barely remembered but who had loved her so much. Now, sitting on the floor of her childhood bedroom, I unfolded the document with trembling fingers. I'd read it a dozen times over the years, but tonight, for the first time, I noticed something I'd always skimmed over in the legal jargon. The use of these resources will depend on the emotional and moral discretion of the responsible party. The responsible party. Me. The one who wasn't really a father, just a sperm donor who contributed genetically. My hands began to sweat as I read the clause again. It was as if my mother was speaking directly to me across time, giving me permission to make a judgment call. I closed my eyes and could almost hear her voice. "You'll know when the time comes, James." Was this the time she meant? Had she somehow known that this day might come? I carefully folded the will and returned it to the chest, my mind racing. There was something else too. Something about my mother's relationship with Katie that had always puzzled me. The way she would sometimes look at my daughter with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not sadness exactly, but something knowing. As if she understood something about Katie that I didn't. "What did you see, Mom?" I whispered to the empty room. "What did you know that I missed?" I closed the cedar chest and pushed it back under the bed. Then I sat on the edge of the mattress, surrounded by the remnants of a childhood I had nurtured. The digital clock on the nightstand showed 9:37 p.m. By now, Katie would be celebrating with her friends, perhaps laughing about the sperm donor comment, unaware of the crater it had left in my chest. The house felt eerily quiet. For years it had been filled with her laughter, her music, her friends coming and going. Now it was just me and the ghosts of memories that apparently meant nothing to her. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen. No messages, no calls. Not that I expected any. In her world, I had been reduced to a biological function. In my world, I was a father grieving the loss of a daughter who was still very much alive. As I sat there, something hardened inside me. Not just pain, but resolve. I thought of my mother's words in the will again. Emotional and moral discretion. Perhaps it was time to exercise that discretion in a way I never imagined I would. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I pulled out an old photo album and turned the pages slowly, watching Katie grow from a toothless baby to a gap-toothed child to a beautiful young woman. With each page I asked myself, had I misread everything? Had I been fooling myself all these years? Or had something, or someone, poisoned her against me? By dawn I had made a decision. The trust fund my mother had left would not go to Katie. Not now. Not as she was. But what would I do with it? That answer came to me as the first light of morning filtered through the blinds, illuminating a path forward I never could have anticipated. A path that would either heal the wound between us or sever the connection forever. The morning after graduation, I found myself staring at a stack of papers on my desk. 18 years of documents where I had signed my name as legal guardian, or responsible adult, never father. The realization hit me like a physical blow. It started with the preschool enrollment forms. I remember the day clearly. Katie was 4. Her hair in uneven pigtails I'd attempted to fashion while she squirmed impatiently. The woman at the front desk had slid the paperwork across to me. "Relation to child?" she'd asked, pen poised. Before I could answer, my then-wife Monica interjected, "He's her guardian. Legal guardian." I'd given her a puzzled look, but she squeezed my arm. "It's better this way, James. One day her real father might come back. We shouldn't confuse things." But that day never came, and I stayed. Year after year, form after form, I checked the box labeled guardian, or sometimes other. Parent-teacher conferences where I was introduced as Katie's guardian. Soccer registration forms where I wrote legal guardian in neat block letters. Hospital intake paperwork where nurses looked at me with that slight confusion when I couldn't check father. I remembered one particular night when Katie was 7. She'd come down with a vicious stomach bug. I held her hair back as she vomited for hours, her tiny body shaking with the effort. I stripped and remade her bed 3 times that night, washing soiled sheets at 2 a.m., all while monitoring her temperature that hovered dangerously near 103 degrees. The next morning, bleary-eyed and exhausted, I called in sick to work. My boss wasn't happy. We were in the middle of a major project. But Katie needed me. She spent the day curled against my chest on the couch, watching cartoons and sipping the ginger ale I'd gone out at dawn to buy. "Why doesn't my real daddy ever call me?" she'd asked suddenly, her voice small and raspy. The question caught me off guard. I struggled to find words that wouldn't betray Monica's instruction to leave the door open for Katie's biological father. "Sometimes people aren't ready to be daddies," I said finally. "But that doesn't mean they don't love you." "Does he love me?" she pressed, her feverish eyes locked on mine. I swallowed hard and told the first of many lies I would tell to protect a man I'd never met. "I'm sure he does, sweetheart. Sometimes love isn't enough to make people stay." She seemed to accept this, nestling closer against my chest. "I'm glad you stayed. she whispered before drifting off to sleep. I stayed through it all. Through the chicken pox that left her covered in calamine lotion and miserable. Through the broken arm when she fell from the monkey bars in 5th grade. Through her first period when Monica was away on a business trip, and I had to awkwardly buy supplies and offer comfort while reading from a pamphlet I'd hurriedly purchased at the pharmacy. I stayed when my old Ford F-150 needed to be sold to cover an MRI that our insurance wouldn't pay for. Katie had been having migraines and the doctor wanted to rule out anything serious. I loved that truck, had restored it myself over 3 summers, but I didn't hesitate. Katie's health wasn't negotiable. I stayed even after Monica left, claiming she needed to find herself in Arizona with a yoga instructor named Paulo. Katie was 14 then, awkward and angry, blaming me for her mother's departure despite all evidence to the contrary. "If you were my real dad, she wouldn't have left," she'd screamed during one particularly brutal argument. I absorbed the blow without correction, without reminding her of all the ways I had been more real than the man who donated genetic material and vanished. For 18 years I accepted this strange half-existence, this shadow life where I performed every function of fatherhood without the title, where I loved unconditionally, but was conditionally loved in return, where I was forever temporary, forever insufficient, forever waiting for a ghost to appear and reclaim what was rightfully his. And now, sitting in my silent house the day after graduation, I finally understood. My absence as father on paper had allowed this distortion to take root and flourish. I had enabled the narrative that I was just a placeholder, just a shadow man caring from the darkness, just a sperm donor who contributed genetically. The realization came with a wave of anger so intense it made my hands shake. Not at Katie, though her words had been the blade that finally cut me open, but at myself, at Monica, at the biological father who never showed, at the entire system that had allowed me to be erased, despite being present for every moment that mattered. I gathered up all those documents, report cards signed James Marlowe Guardian, permission slips, medical forms, and stuffed them into an old leather portfolio. Then I went to the kitchen, made myself a strong cup of coffee, and sat at the table with a legal pad. It was time to make a decision about the trust fund, about my mother's words regarding emotional and moral discretion, about what it truly meant to be a father versus a donor. Maybe it was time to show Katie exactly what being just a donor really meant, not out of spite or revenge, though I couldn't deny those emotions swirled somewhere in the mix, but out of a desperate need to reclaim my own narrative, to define myself after 18 years of allowing others to define me. As I began to write, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, raw and throbbing, but alongside it was something I hadn't felt in years. The sensation of standing up straight after bending for too long, of finally speaking after years of silence, of becoming visible after a lifetime in the shadows. The law office of Harrington and Associates occupied the 8th floor of a glass-fronted building in downtown Spokane. I'd moved here 3 years ago after Katie started college, needing distance from the California home where her childhood echoed in every room. Now, as I sat in the reception area with its leather chairs and tasteful abstract paintings, I clutched my mother's will in one hand and gripped the armrest with the other. "Mr. Marlowe?" The receptionist's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Mr. Harrington will see you now." Robert Harrington was in his 60s, with silver hair and the careful posture of a man who had spent decades delivering both good and bad news to clients. We'd met briefly when I first arrived in Spokane and needed to update some documents. He rose from behind his mahogany desk as I entered, extending his hand. "James, good to see you again. Though I sense this isn't a social call." I managed a tight smile. "No, it's not." The leather portfolio containing 18 years of Guardian signatures felt heavy in my hand. "I need to make some changes regarding a trust fund." He gestured for me to sit, and I did, placing my mother's will on his desk. As he read through it, I stared out the window at the Spokane skyline, watching clouds gather on the horizon. A storm was coming. "Fitting. This is straightforward enough," he said finally. "Your mother left substantial funds for your daughter, with you as trustee until she turns 25. What changes did you have in mind?" I took a deep breath. The words I'd rehearsed all night suddenly felt strange in my mouth. "I want to redirect the funds, all of them." Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly. "May I ask why?" "These funds were specifically designated for Catherine's future. She called me a sperm donor at her graduation," I said. the words tumbling out before I could package them more elegantly. In front of hundreds of people, after 18 years of raising her, something softened in Harrington's expression. Not quite pity, I couldn't have borne pity, but understanding. I see. That's extremely painful. I'm sorry, James. I've been thinking about my mother's wording here, I continued, pointing to the clause about emotional and moral discretion. I believe she gave me this latitude for a reason. What exactly do you have in mind for the funds? I leaned forward, my voice steadier now. I want to establish a community sperm bank, free services for families who need them, and I want it named after Catherine. Harrington blinked, clearly not expecting this answer. That's unusual. So is being called a sperm donor by your daughter after 18 years, I replied. He studied me for a long moment. Is this about revenge, James? Because in my experience, it's not revenge, I interrupted, though even I wasn't entirely convinced. It's about recognition, about making visible what's been invisible, about creating something meaningful from this pain. Harrington leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Are you sure you want to do this, Mr. Marlowe? Trust funds can be substantial. Your daughter might view this as, well, extreme. I nodded, my resolve hardening. I'm sure. And I want a plaque at the entrance that reads, "In honor of paternal love that went unrecognized." The words hung in the air between us. I could see Harrington calculating, not just the legal ramifications, but the human ones. Finally, he sighed. I'll draw up the paperwork. It will take a few days. You should know that once this is done, it may be difficult to undo. I understand. As I left his office an hour later, having signed the preliminary documents, rain had begun to fall on Spokane. I stood under the building's awning, watching droplets splatter against the pavement, creating tiny explosions before disappearing into the concrete. Was I doing the right thing? I honestly didn't know. But for the first time since hearing Katie's words at graduation, I felt like I was doing something. Not just absorbing blows, not just accepting erasure, but defining myself on my own terms. The news spread quickly through what remained of my family. My nephew Jason called first. "Uncle James," he said, laughter barely contained in his voice. "Tell me this is a joke. You're starting a sperm bank named after Katie?" Mom is freaking out. My sister-in-law, Rachel, Monica's younger sister, was next. She didn't laugh. "Have you lost your mind?" Her voice was ice over the phone. "This is beyond petty, James. It's deranged." "Is it?" I asked quietly. "Is it worse than letting a child believe her father didn't want her? Is it worse than erasing 18 years of love with a single sentence?" Rachel went silent. Then, with strange intensity, "You need to stop this. Now." "Why do you care what I do with my mother's money?" I asked. Another pause. "Because Katie is family, and you're hurting her to make some twisted point. Funny how I was family when you needed a babysitter or money for Katie's field trips or someone to pick her up from your house at 2 a.m. when she got sick at sleepovers. But I'm not family enough to be called her father." Rachel hung up. I wasn't surprised. She'd always been Monica's ally, even after the divorce. Always slightly cold toward me, as if my presence was a necessary inconvenience rather than a valued addition to the family. What did surprise me was how little their reactions bothered me. A week ago, their disapproval would have cut deep. Now it felt distant, like criticism from strangers. 3 days later, Harrington called to tell me everything was in order. The James Marlowe Foundation for Family Building was officially established, with the Catherine Elizabeth Marlowe Donor Center as its first project. Construction would begin on a building near the Spokane Valley Medical Center within the month. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, I tried to imagine Katie's reaction when she heard the news. Would she be angry, hurt, confused, or would she finally understand what it meant to be erased by someone you love? I didn't know, but for the first time since her graduation, I felt like I was breathing again, like I existed again, like the 18 years I'd given weren't just smoke to be blown away by a careless sentence, to being more than a donor, I whispered, raising my coffee mug to the darkening sky, to being remembered. The basement of my Spokane home had become a repository for cardboard boxes, the physical archive of a life partially lived and hastily packed when I fled California. 3 weeks after my meeting with Harrington, I found myself descending the creaking wooden stairs, armed with a flashlight and a determination to sort through the accumulated debris of my past. The air down there was thick with dust and the peculiar smell of paper aging in darkness. Cobwebs stretched between boxes labeled in my hurried handwriting. Kitchen, books, Katie, elementary, Katie, middle school. Names and categories that had once seemed permanent, now rendered strange by time and heartbreak. I hadn't planned to unpack these particular memories today. My original mission had been practical. Find the old tax returns I needed for the foundation paperwork. But as I moved aside a tower of boxes, one tipped over, spilling its contents across the concrete floor. Photo albums, loose photographs, and small mementos scattered like autumn leaves. Damn it, I muttered, kneeling to gather them. My knees protested, a reminder of both my age and the high school basketball injury that still flared up in damp weather. Among the mess, a blue album caught my eye. The cover was worn around the edges. The once bright color faded to a muted shade that reminded me of Katie's bedroom walls in our old house. I recognized it immediately. The summer album from when Katie was 6, the summer before everything changed. With hands that suddenly felt unsteady, I opened it. The first photo showed Katie in our backyard, her gap-toothed smile radiant as she proudly displayed a caterpillar on her palm. I remembered taking that picture, how she'd named the caterpillar Mr. Fuzzy, and insisted on creating a habitat for it in a shoebox. I turned the pages slowly, each image a pinprick to my heart. Katie learning to ride her bike. Katie at the beach, buried up to her neck in sand with only her laughing face visible. Katie helping me grill hamburgers, standing on a stool to reach the barbecue, her expression serious with the responsibility. Then I paused. A photo I didn't remember. Katie standing in our backyard with Rachel, my ex-sister-in-law. They were making silly faces at the camera, Rachel's arm draped casually around Katie's shoulders. Nothing unusual about the image itself. Rachel had been a regular presence in our lives, but something about it nagged at me. I carefully removed the photo from its plastic sleeve and turned it over. Nothing written on the back. But as I went to replace it, I noticed another photograph behind it, one that had been partially hidden. I slid it out and immediately felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath me. It was Rachel, younger, her hair longer than I remembered her ever wearing it, standing on what looked like a beach. Her arms were wrapped around a man's waist, her head tilted up toward him adoringly. They were both smiling, caught in that peculiar moment of bliss that exists only between lovers. The man's face hit me like a physical blow. I'd never met him, but I'd seen him before. In the single photograph Monica had shown me years ago. The biological father of my daughter. The man who had donated genetic material and vanished. The ghost whose absence had shaped my entire relationship with Katie. But he hadn't vanished. At least, not from everyone's life. The date stamp in the corner of the photo read June 15, 2003, 2 months before Katie was born. My hands began to shake so violently that the photo fluttered to the floor. The implications crashed through my mind like breaking glass. Rachel had known him, not just known him. The intimacy in that embrace wasn't the casual affection between acquaintances. They had been close, very close. And if the date was accurate, Rachel had still been in contact with him right before Katie's birth. While Monica was telling me he had disappeared, wanted nothing to do with the baby. She knew, I whispered to the empty basement, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. She always knew. The pieces began to align with sickening clarity. Rachel's perpetual coldness toward me, her subtle undermining of my relationship with Katie, the way she would sometimes watch us together with an expression I could never quite read. She had helped erase my presence, protecting a man who had abandoned both Monica and Katie, and who had told Katie the distorted version of history that led to her graduation speech. It had to be Rachel. The poison had been planted there, watered and tended, until it grew into the words that had gutted me on what should have been one of the proudest days of my life. I sat on the cold basement floor, surrounded by the physical evidence of 18 years of fatherhood, holding the proof that it had all been built on a foundation of lies. The pain I felt at the graduation ceremony wasn't just rejection. It was the culmination of a narrative carefully constructed to minimize me, to keep me in the shadows, to ensure I remained just a guardian, no matter how many fevers I soothed or nightmares I chased away. With careful, deliberate movements, I returned both photographs to the album, closed it, and placed it in a box I labeled Evidence in bold black marker. Then I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, carrying the weight of this new knowledge. In the kitchen, I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, something I rarely did before evening. and stared out the window at my small Spokane backyard. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. Appropriate weather for the storm brewing inside me. The foundation was set to break ground in 2 weeks. The plaque was being engraved. Soon the Catherine Elizabeth Marlowe Donor Center would be more than just paperwork and plans. It would be real. As real as the 18 years I'd given to a child who had been taught to see me as nothing more than a biological function. I took a long swallow of bourbon, feeling it burn down my throat. For the first time since the graduation, I felt something beyond hurt and betrayal. I felt clarity. And with clarity came resolve. The truth needed to come out. Not just for me, but for Katie. She deserved to know the full story, not the version Rachel had fed her. And I deserved to reclaim the title I had earned through thousands of sleepless nights, tens of thousands of meals cooked, and countless moments of love given without condition or recognition. The title of father. The Catherine Elizabeth Marlowe Donor Center stood completed on a quiet corner near the Spokane Valley Medical Center, a modern single-story building with large windows and a small garden out front. The grand opening was scheduled for the following week, but I had come early, watching from my car as workers installed the plaque beside the entrance. From this distance I couldn't read the words, but I knew them by heart. In honor of paternal love that went unrecognized. Simple, direct, true. My phone buzzed. A text from Jason, my nephew. "Uncle Jay, have you seen this?" Attached was a link to a social media post. Catherine's account. I hadn't even known she was in Spokane until I opened the image. My daughter standing in front of the still unopened center, her expression a mixture of shock and fury. The caption read, "When your so-called guardian uses your name for a twisted joke. Sperm bank revenge, unbelievable." I closed my eyes, taking a slow breath before looking again. The comment section was already filling with her friends expressing outrage on her behalf. Some laughed at the savage comeback. Others suggested legal action. None of them knew the truth. None of them had seen the photograph hidden in my basement. I was about to start the car and leave when a silver BMW pulled into the parking lot. The door opened and Catherine stepped out. Not the digital version from my phone screen, but my actual daughter in the flesh. She wore black jeans and a Stanford sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Even from a distance I could see the tension in her shoulders, the determined set of her jaw. She stood before the building, hands on her hips, as if confronting an enemy. Then she noticed the workers installing the plaque and marched toward them. I couldn't hear what she said, but her gestures were animated, angry. The workers glanced at each other uneasily. Without thinking, I got out of my car. "Katie," I called, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. She spun around, and for a moment the years fell away. I saw flashes of the little girl who had run to me with scraped knees, the teenager who had slammed doors during arguments, the child I had loved through every phase and mood. Then her expression hardened. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, voice cold enough to frost the June air. "This is seriously what you're doing with your retirement? Creating a monument to spite?" "It's not spite," I said, approaching slowly, like one might a wounded animal. "It's recognition." "Recognition?" She laughed, a harsh sound nothing like her normal laugh. "You're using my name on a sperm bank because I hurt your feelings. How is that not spite?" A small crowd had begun to gather, the workers, a few people from nearby businesses, drawn by the volume and intensity of our exchange. Among them, I noticed a man with a press badge hanging from his neck, watching with undisguised interest. "Your speech hurt more than my feelings, Catherine," I said quietly. "It erased 18 years of my life." "Oh, please," she rolled her eyes. But something flickered across her face. Uncertainty, perhaps. "Don't be so dramatic, it was just a joke." "A joke?" I nodded slowly. "Was it also a joke when I stayed up for 3 nights straight when you had pneumonia? When I sold my truck to pay for your MRI? When I taught you to drive, helped with your college applications, came to every debate tournament?" She shifted her weight, crossing her arms defensively. "That's what guardians do." "No," I corrected gently. "That's what fathers do." The man with the press badge had moved closer, notebook now in hand. "Excuse me," he said, addressing us both. "I'm Steve Larkin from the Spokesman Review. I'm doing a piece on the new center. Are you connected to this establishment?" Before I could answer, Catherine jumped in. "He's using my name without permission for a publicity stunt." "I'm James Marlowe," I said, extending my hand to the reporter. "The founder, and this is my daughter Catherine." "I'm not your daughter," she snapped. You made that very clear with this little stunt. Steve Larkin's eyebrows rose. He sensed a story bigger than a simple business opening. Mr. Marlowe, may I ask what inspired you to create a sperm bank named after Ms. Marlowe? I looked at Catherine, then at the small crowd that had gathered, then back to the reporter. I'd spent 18 years staying quiet, accepting shadows, protecting others at my own expense. No more. I raised Catherine from the time she was 3 months old, I said, my voice steady. At her college graduation, she publicly called me the sperm donor who contributed genetically but was never really a father. After 18 years of bedtime stories, soccer games, doctor's appointments, and tuition payments, Steve's pen moved rapidly across his notebook. Catherine's face flushed. That's not the whole story, she protested. No, I agreed. It's not. Would you like to hear the whole story, Mr. Larkin? Without anger, without bitterness, just the truth. He nodded eagerly. So I told him about meeting Monica when Catherine was 3 months old, about changing diapers and soothing teething pain and teaching first steps, about signing forms as guardian because we were told her biological father might return someday, about the divorce, the sacrifices, the love that never wavered even when it wasn't returned in full measure. I spoke without accusation, without self-pity, just facts, laid bare like stones on a path. When I finished, Steve turned to Catherine. Ms. Marlowe, would you like to comment? Her eyes were wide, fixed on me as if seeing a stranger. You did all this to get back at me? To humiliate me? No. I shook my head. I did this to be visible, to claim the title I earned through years of love, to stop accepting erasure. Something shifted in her expression then, a hairline fracture in the armor of righteousness she'd been wearing. Did you really sell your truck for my MRI? She asked, her voice smaller. The blue F-150 I restored myself. Yes. Your headaches were getting worse. The insurance wouldn't cover the scan. It was an easy choice. Mom always said we got financial help from her parents. I smiled sadly. Your mother said a lot of things. The crowd had grown larger. Phones were out, recording our exchange. This wasn't how I'd imagined our confrontation, but perhaps there was something fitting about having witnesses after years of invisible love. Mr. Marlowe, Steve Larkin interjected. What would you say to other non-biological parents who feel unrecognized? I considered the question carefully. I'd say that love isn't about DNA. It's about showing up. It's about choosing to stay when it would be easier to leave. It's about earning the title of parent one sleepless night, one homework assignment, one heartbreak at a time. Catherine was staring at me, something unreadable in her expression. You did this to make a point, she said, but the accusation had less heat now. I did this so that no one else has to question what makes someone a father, I replied simply. 2 days later, Steve Larkin's article went viral. My phone began lighting up with notifications, messages, interview requests. The story had struck a chord, not just locally, but nationally. Blended families, step-parents, adoptive parents, all sharing their stories of invisible love and unrecognized sacrifice. And in the middle of the storm, a single text message from Catherine. Did you do this for revenge? I stared at those 6 words for a long time before typing my response. I did this so that no one else has to ask what it means to be a father. She didn't reply, but the seed had been planted, a question she would have to answer for herself. 14 days after Steve Larkin's article went viral, I was sitting on my front porch nursing a glass of iced tea and watching the summer evening settle over my quiet Spokane neighborhood. The maple trees lining the street cast long shadows across freshly mowed lawns. A sprinkler whirred rhythmically 2 houses down. Ordinary sounds, ordinary sights, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. My phone sat silent beside me. It had been ringing constantly for days after the story broke. Journalists, talk show producers, book agents, all wanting to capture the story of the man who built a sperm bank, named after the daughter who rejected him. I'd declined most interviews, agreeing only to a thoughtful podcast about non-traditional families and a brief statement for a parenting magazine. The attention felt strange, uncomfortable. For 18 years I'd been invisible, the guardian, the placeholder, the shadow man caring from the darkness. Now, suddenly, strangers knew my name, knew my pain. Some called me a hero for non-biological parents everywhere. Others criticized what they saw as a petty act of revenge. Neither label felt right. I was just a man who had finally stopped accepting erasure. The photo from the basement, Rachel with Katie's biological father, remained in a sealed envelope on my desk. I hadn't shown it to anyone yet, not even Catherine. That particular truth bomb felt too destructive to deploy without careful consideration, but its existence had changed something in me, confirmed that the narrative I'd been fed for years was fundamentally flawed. A car engine disrupted my thoughts. A silver BMW, the same one I'd seen at the center, pulled up in front of my house. My heart stuttered in my chest as Catherine emerged, closing the door with deliberate care. She stood for a moment beside the vehicle, as if gathering courage before walking up the path toward my porch. She looked different than she had at the center 2 weeks earlier. Smaller somehow. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She wore faded jeans and a simple t-shirt, not the polished graduate who had stood at a microphone and erased me with a sentence. I didn't stand to greet her. Something in me couldn't make that gesture yet. The wound was still too fresh, the betrayal too raw. "Hello, Catherine," I said, my voice carefully neutral. She stopped at the foot of the porch steps, looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Can I come up?" she asked, her voice hoarse, as if she'd been crying or hadn't slept. I nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. She climbed the steps slowly and sat, her movements tentative, like those of someone in physical pain. For several long minutes we sat in silence, watching the fireflies begin to emerge in the gathering dusk. "I talked to Aunt Rachel," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at her, saying nothing, waiting. "She told me," Catherine swallowed hard, her hands twisting in her lap. "She told me that you weren't my biological father, that Mom was already pregnant when you met her, that my real father left before I was born because he wasn't ready for a child." The familiar story, the comfortable lie. "And then?" I prompted gently. Catherine's eyes welled with tears. "And then I asked her why you never told me yourself. Why, if you knew all along, you let me believe." Her voice broke. She got weird. Started saying things didn't matter now, that the past was the past. But I kept pushing. I leaned forward slightly, every muscle in my body tense. She finally admitted that she knew him, my biological father, that they had been... Catherine closed her eyes, a tear escaping down her cheek. That they had been seeing each other, before I was born, and after. "I know," I said quietly. Her eyes flew open. "You knew? All this time?" I shook my head. "Not all this time. I found a photograph in the basement a few weeks ago. Rachel with him. Dated 2 months before you were born." Catherine's face crumpled. "Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me?" I asked, not unkindly. "Or would you have seen it as another manipulation from the man you called a sperm donor?" She flinched at the reminder. I never should have said that. It was cruel and wrong. "Yes," I agreed simply. "It was." More silence fell between us, heavy with 2 decades of misunderstandings and half-truths. "Why did you never tell me you weren't my biological father?" she finally asked, her voice small. I sighed, looking out at the darkening street. "Your mother asked me not to. She said your real father might come back someday and she didn't want to confuse you. And then, it just became the pattern. The longer it went on, the harder it was to break. But you raised me. You were there for everything." "Yes. And I..." Her voice caught. "I called you a sperm donor, in front of everyone." The memory still had the power to knock the wind from my lungs. "Yes. Why didn't you say something right then? Why didn't you stand up and tell everyone the truth?" I turned to look at her directly. "Because that's not what fathers do, Catherine. Fathers protect their children, even when it hurts. Even when the child is doing the hurting." She broke then, a sob tearing from her throat as she doubled over in the chair, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold something broken together. "I'm so sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm so sorry." The sight of her pain, raw, unfiltered, cut through my own. For 18 years I had responded instinctively to her tears, moving to comfort without hesitation. But now something inside me hesitated. The wound she had inflicted wasn't a skinned knee I could bandage or a broken toy I could fix. It was a fundamental rejection of everything I had been to her. "I don't know if sorry is enough this time, Katie," I said gently, using her childhood nickname for the first time since the graduation. Some things once broken can't be glued back together the same way. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, suddenly resembling the 5-year-old who had broken my favorite coffee mug and stood before me with identical remorse. What can I do? Please, tell me what I can do to fix this. I shook my head slowly. I don't know if I have that answer. I don't know if there is an answer. There has to be, she insisted, a flash of the determination I'd always admired in her breaking through the grief. I was wrong, horribly wrong. I listened to the wrong people and believed the wrong story. But you're my father. In all the ways that matter, you're my father. The words I had longed to hear for 18 years. Yet they arrived now like rain after a forest has already burned. Welcome, necessary, but too late to save what was lost. I need time, I said finally. This isn't something I can just move past because you've realized the truth. The hurt is still there. The betrayal is still fresh. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I understand. I'll wait, as long as it takes. As she rose to leave, she hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small box. I brought this for you. You don't have to open it now. Just when you're ready. She placed it on the small table between our chairs and descended the porch steps. At her car, she turned back. I love you, Dad, she said, the word deliberate and clear in the evening air. Then she was gone, taillights disappearing around the corner, leaving me alone with an unopened box and the first glimmer of what might be forgiveness taking root beside the pain. The box Catherine had left sat untouched on my bedside table for 3 months. Each morning I would wake and see it there, small, unassuming, wrapped in simple blue paper that reminded me of her childhood bedroom. Each night, I would consider opening it, my fingers sometimes hovering over the carefully tied ribbon before retreating. I wasn't ready. The wound was still too fresh, the scar tissue too thin. Autumn arrived in Spokane with a painter's palette of amber and crimson. The maple trees outside my window blazed with color before surrendering their leaves to the increasingly insistent wind. I found myself spending more time on the porch, wrapped in a flannel jacket, watching the neighborhood children kick through piles of crackling leaves, their laughter carrying on the crisp air. The Catherine Elizabeth Marlowe Donor Center had been open for nearly 4 months. According to the monthly reports I received, it had already helped dozens of families begin their journeys toward parenthood. The publicity from Steve Larkin's article had brought in additional donations, allowing us to expand services beyond what I'd initially envisioned. We now offered counseling for blended families, support groups for non-biological parents, and educational resources about the many forms family can take. I hadn't heard from Catherine since that evening on the porch. I knew she was giving me the space I had asked for, respecting the boundaries I had set. But her absence was its own kind of presence, a negative space defined by what wasn't there, like a photo with a figure cut out, the missing shape more noticeable than what remained. On the first truly cold day of October, I finally reached for the box. My hands didn't shake, my breath didn't catch. It was simply time, like the moment you know a wound has healed enough to remove the bandage and face what's underneath. The paper came away easily, revealing a small wooden box with a simple brass latch. Inside, nested in tissue paper, was a single envelope, not store-bought, but crafted from what looked like handmade paper, my name written across the front in Catherine's distinctive handwriting, slightly slanted to the right, the J in James looping in a way that had always reminded me of musical notation. I carried the envelope to the kitchen table and sat down, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, casting long shadows across the polished wood. With steady hands, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Dad, yes, Dad, it began, the words hitting me with the force of recognition after years of James or Guardian on official documents. I have taken too long to understand. I grew up hearing the wrong story, and the truth is that, even without knowing it, I was loved by you in silence. Forgive me for not seeing, for not feeling, and for calling you something so small. If there is still room for me in your life, let me in. With love, the girl from the backyard. The girl from the backyard. The nickname I'd given her when she was 4. Forever digging in the garden, bringing me fistfuls of dandelions and explaining in serious tones the fairy civilizations she'd discovered under the rhododendron bushes. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the blue necktie I'd worn to her graduation, the one I'd kept as a reminder of that day, of the moment everything changed. I didn't call her, didn't text. But that afternoon I drove to the Catherine Elizabeth Marlowe Donor Center and asked to speak with the director. Sarah Chen had been running the center since its opening, bringing warmth and professionalism to a role that required both. She greeted me with the same gentle deference she always showed, ushering me into her office where photographs of families the center had helped line the walls. "Mr. Marlowe, what can I do for you today?" she asked, offering me a seat. "The plaque at the entrance," I said without preamble. "I'd like to change it." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "Of course. What would you like it to say?" I handed her a piece of paper with the new wording I'd composed on the drive over. She read it silently, then looked up at me with understanding in her eyes. "This is beautiful," she said simply. "I'll have it done this week." 2 days later, I stood before the new plaque, running my fingers over the engraved words, "In honor of the love that resisted forgetting." Not a statement of pain or absence, but of presence, of endurance, of the kind of love that remains even when unrecognized. I took a photograph of it and sent it to Catherine, the first contact I had initiated since our conversation on the porch. No words, just the image. Her response came within minutes. A single heart emoji followed by, "Can I come home?" Home. Such a simple word, such a complicated concept. Was my house in Spokane her home? Was I still home to her after everything? Could we rebuild what had been broken? Or would we need to construct something entirely new from the ruins? I stared at her message for a long time before typing, "Yes." She arrived the following evening, just as dusk was settling over the neighborhood. I heard her car before I saw it, the distinctive purr of the BMW's engine as it pulled into my driveway. I remained seated on the porch watching as she emerged, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her steps hesitant as she approached. "Hi," she said, stopping at the foot of the steps just as she had 3 months earlier. "Hi," I replied, gesturing to the chair beside me. She climbed the steps and sat, placing the duffel bag at her feet. For several minutes we sat in silence, watching the last light fade from the sky, the first stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue. "I read your letter," I finally said. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the darkening street. "I meant every word." "I know." Another silence, not uncomfortable but weighted with all that remained unsaid between us. "The new plaque is beautiful," she offered. "Thank you for changing it." "It's more accurate now," I said simply. She turned to look at me then, her eyes searching my face. "Can we start over? Not forget what happened, but move forward from here?" I considered her question carefully. Could we? Was it possible to rebuild from such a fundamental fracture? I thought of all the times I had repaired things for her over the years. Broken toys, ripped clothing, school projects gone awry. I had always found a way to fix what was broken, to make things whole again. "Not over," I said finally. "But forward, yes. I think we can try." The relief in her face was palpable, years seeming to fall away as her shoulders relaxed. "That's all I ask. A chance to try." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small that caught the porch light. The locket I had brought to her graduation but never given her. "I found this in your desk when I was looking for stationery for my letter. It's beautiful." I nodded, memories flooding back. "It was supposed to be your graduation gift. Before I ruined everything," she finished quietly. "Not ruined," I corrected gently. "Wounded. But wounds heal, given time and care." She held the locket out to me. "Would you put it on me, please?" I took the delicate chain from her hand, our fingers brushing briefly. She turned, lifting her hair away from her neck, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. With hands that remembered this dance from birthdays and Christmases past, I fastened the clasp, the small click sounding like the closing of a circle. When she turned back, her hand went to the locket, fingers tracing its contours. "Thank you, Dad." The word hung between us, no longer a title withheld or a recognition denied, but a simple truth, hard-won and finally acknowledged. "You're welcome, Katie," I replied, using her childhood name deliberately, offering my own recognition in return. As night settled fully around us, we began to talk, tentatively at first, then with growing ease. Not about the past, not yet, but about the present, about her new job in Seattle, about the book I had started writing, about the ordinary details of our separate lives that we were perhaps beginning to weave together again. It wasn't forgiveness, not completely. It wasn't healing, not fully. But it was a beginning, a seed planted in soil that had once seemed too scorched for anything to grow. And for now, that was enough. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from those we love most. As James discovered, parenthood isn't defined by DNA or legal documents. It's written in late-night fevers, in science projects built at midnight, in trucks sold to pay for medical bills, and in love that persists even when it goes unrecognized. His journey reminds us that true family is built through thousands of small moments of showing up when it would be easier to walk away. What would you have done in James's position? Would you have continued to accept erasure? Or would you have found a way to reclaim your story? When someone reduces your years of love and sacrifice to a biological function, is forgiveness possible? Perhaps the most powerful lesson from James and Catherine's story is that healing doesn't mean erasing the hurt. It means building something new from the broken pieces, something that acknowledges both the pain and the love that survived it. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful human stories to light. Remember, we all have invisible battles we're fighting, and sometimes the people who seem strongest are carrying the heaviest burdens. What story of unrecognized love do you carry? Share your thoughts in the comments below and join our community of storytellers and listeners who believe that every sacrifice, every act of love, even those that go unseen, matters.